Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Poona Sci-Fi Book Club, a podcast where we review and discuss science fiction books that we've read recently. The book we're talking about today is Morgan J. Locke's Up Against It, which came out in 2011. We'll spend the first few minutes of this episode on a spoiler-free or a spoiler-light at least review of the book. At that point, if you plan to read the book, you can stop and come back when you're done. We'll then spend the rest of our time discussing the book in more detail. So without further delay, let's introduce our three hosts. I am Mohit Karve.
Varat Deshmukh.
So to get us off started, Varat, do you want to tell us a little bit about the book?
Okay. So my impression about this book is it's basically a soft sci-fi book. The broad sort of genre here is it's a space opera / a political thriller / a space crisis book. Essentially, the story takes place. Well, if you guys have seen The Expanse, which is on Amazon Prime, the setting in this book is very similar. And I don't want to keep drawing that comparison throughout this podcast, but just to give you some sort of basis, humans in this book have colonized almost all of the solar system, the asteroid belt, basically the inner planets, Earth, Mars, the asteroid belt. There's some colonization in the Jovian planets, and there's all sorts of commercial activity going on. Humans have gone as far as to start bringing in water / ice from the Kuiper belt, which goes beyond Pluto, and so that's the sort of the status of this of the solar system in this book. This story takes place primarily on an asteroid in the asteroid belt, which is again between Mars and Jupiter. It's an asteroid called as 25 Phocea, which is a real asteroid. If you guys want to go ahead and check. So basically, the humans which are living in this asteroid are primarily dependent on methane ice, which again, as I mentioned, they bring from all parts of the world of the solar system. So the main sort of use of this methane ice is for generating resources. They rely on these things called as assemblers and disassemblers, which are used for producing food, other sort of day-to-day requirements or day-to-day objects. And then there are these disassemblers, which sort of break them down into these basic components. And they do it using what is called as bug juice, which requires methane somehow. And that part I'm not very clear on how that happens. So that's how they are. So they basically are living in a massive recycling system where they produce and then just produce their own stuff and then break it down to produce new stuff again. So there's this other interesting thing in this book, which is this concept of upside down, which is a media conglomerate. That and the way it comes in context of this asteroid, which is 25 Phocea, is that they are recording. There's a live sort of recording of every event that's happening on the asteroid. Basically, Upside Down has a contract with 25 Phocea for a year to record all the things that are going on, which is then filmed as a reality TV show for the people on the inner planets. And in exchange, 25 Phocea after a year will get good communication sort of capabilities as part of the contract. I think that was the two main aspects which I thought were interesting. The third one, I think, is also the AI, or basically the how their computer systems have been developed. What's happening in their massive computer systems network is the spontaneous sort of emergence of sentient AI. And what their systems do is when such an AI emerges, their internal sort of security systems attack it and bring it down to make sure it doesn't take over the entire network. And there's a reason because that plays an important part in the book. But anyway, so this is the premise, or this is the setting of the book. The story begins with a particular event that is triggered on 25 Phocea, where a plant which does the production of resources and which does the disassembling of resources there's something that happens there which leads to the destruction of the facility and the loss of this bug juice, which leads to the methane ice getting just consumed in that in sort of a mass reaction that is triggered, which means now the planet has to get new ice in the next 25 days, or the entire asteroid will sort of die off. So that is the crisis that is triggered, and that's where the story picks up. What did you guys think about the book?
So I think if I had to give my first impression, kind of classify this differently. I think of this as a cyberpunk novel because it's actually quite different from The Expanse. I feel like in the details of it. I agree that it's not hard science fiction; it's more soft science fiction. But I mean, my first impression of this book is it has a lot of things going on, both in terms of plot lines, themes, ideas, and they're all jumbled together in this thing. It does take it and I think if you ask among the various strains of like political intrigue versus realistic hard sci-fi take on asteroid mining and that kind of thing versus like cyberpunk elements versus like this thing, I think the cyberpunk element is the strongest vein for me, which goes through it in terms of consistent story. And I kept forgetting that this book was written in 2010. I kept thinking it's like written much longer, but so I think it's an interesting time for that book to be written. Some parts of it. So overall, I think it's a very like uneven book because there are parts of it that if you then jump into even in the characters, right? There are basically two broad sets of characters. There's like the resource administrator of the asteroid, who's one character that you kind of follow around as she's trying to solve the crisis that has come about. And then there are these this is a group of teenagers essentially who are involved in this whole incident. And kind of the tonality between the two groups is also fairly different, through the book itself. So I think that's my like overall impression of the book, that there are some very interesting ideas, but I felt the ideas are most interesting along the cyberpunk line of ideas in the book. And it has a kind of a lot going on at the same time. I could cut another book from within this book and it would probably be like much more cohesive kind of story. So yeah, so that's my impression of the book.
Just to add one more thing, I didn't mean that it's like The Expanse. I just wanted to say the setting of the book is like The Expanse.
Yeah.
There's the human colonization in the solar system. Go ahead, Mohit.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I don't think it's like entirely a cyberpunk book, but I do agree that there's a lot of cyberpunk elements to it. In terms of storylines, I think I counted what to me at least are like 5 distinct storylines that were all sort of going on continuously in parallel. And I actually thought that it was pretty good the way that all 5 of them tied together at the end and came to a reasonably satisfying conclusion. Like I quite liked the book. The one thing I do want to talk about is the nanobots that Bharat mentioned right at the start. I think that is going back again to our Expanse comparison. That I think is like the most magic part of this book, which exists in the Expanse and they never talk about it. Like they just talk about how like stuff gets dumped into the recycler, like they put unused food, plates, stuff goes into the recycler, and then we just don't see anything. I mean, that's not the point of the Expanse. So not really complaining about that. But I feel like this book really does a good job of explaining how something like that could work, where you just have these nano machines that can convert anything into its constituent atoms and then reconstitute it however you want. Like I thought that was pretty cool and pretty well explained in this book.
Yeah, so I think that element of it was, as you're reading the book and all these are horribly dangerous technologies, like for advanced. Any one of them could, and they do easily like spin out of control. And just the dissembler bots themselves, which are the ones which take apart things. I'm saying that's such a bad idea. I felt that was a bit like magic, but also it kind of breaks the immersion of, okay, this is a really dangerous way of. I can understand the assembly part, but the assembly part of it is just so dangerous. As like,
I don't agree though. I don't agree because she does make a point early in the book to say that the general purpose disassemblers are highly controlled and limited only to the recycling facilities, and the more generally available disassemblers are special purpose ones where like it just breaks down plastic or it just breaks down one thing in particular. So,
but they do use those as a weapon somewhere down the book, right?
They do use it as a weapon. No, yeah. I think it's a type of technology, right? It's something that looks like it will easily spin out of control of the and you see cross-linking technologies across it, which point to that because they have like really advanced hacking, and they have like cybernet, and they have sapient AI things which come about as like these are all machine, like so those all those technologies interlinked together as like this is it's kind, and then at the same time they don't have like other things, right? They don't seem to have faster than light communication, or even
Yeah.
it still takes 2 days. So there's a bit of technology incongruence in that world. Some aspects are very advanced, and
Yeah.
some aspects are not so. So like if we jump into spoilers, we can cover some more, which is like similar. It's a bit. It reminded me a bit of like what Blade Runner is like, because in Blade Runner also you have this off-world colonies, and you have bioengineering to kind of do the colonization, and then you have like at the same time replicants and the AIs. So it had that vibe. But yeah, but I was just reading it as like you will really deserve these crises because this technology is
Um,
horribly dangerous.
I mean, so I sort of noticed that technological incongruency in like a number of things. So if you okay, so these nanobots or the bug juice is apparently programmable, right? So if it is programmable, then why was the crisis triggered in the first place? Can't you program these nanobots to stop their functionality if they are encountering a massive block or like a massive mountain of methane ice, which eventually triggered that mass reaction? I'm assuming there should have been some sort of way to sort of prevent such a chain reaction, especially if your manufacturing facility has that big block of ice very close to your nanobots. That's sort of like that was one incident where I thought where I thought like there was that incongruency. The other part was, and this goes like much later in the book, like on one hand you have got like these sentient AI that are sort of coming up spontaneously in the system, and you've got these smart anti-AI measures that are triggering. But on the other hand, you need like a specialist, a human specialist, to measure the amount of ice, or like measure the amount of, or measure the gravity, like the gravitational force on an asteroid. Like that whole sort of plot with Shuan go, like them needing like some specialist to go there and see how much ice is there on a separate asteroid block. I thought
That's actually a good point. I didn't think of that. I don't really agree with the dissembler thing again, because the whole point of it is that it's like a highly restricted general purpose disassembly location. And they did have fail safes which were bypassed for plot reasons, right? Like they did have fail safes to say that, oh, if these things, like never mind specific things like, oh, methane ice, it's just if they are exposed to open air outside of the disassembly factory, then they should just stop working. And that whole, like the failsafe was bypassed. So I feel like I agree that it's a dangerous technology and all that stuff, but I feel like in book it seems reasonable that it failed the way that it did. Like I don't think it violates any common sense rules inside the world.
Yeah, inside the world, it was because they will explain that it's supposed to freeze, but it doesn't freeze because their system doesn't close in time. And it doesn't close because something happens. But the assembler I can understand as a piece of technology. But if you're trying to get rid of something, like it's not like they said that this is our weapon storage system, right? And we have these dissembler ammunition, got out of control. I would understand that because you put it in a shell and you shoot it out of a ship and it disintegrates the ship. Okay, I get that. It's used in industrial vehicles. Why do you need to vaporize like large amounts when you're in space, right? Just shoot it into Jupiter or something, right? Like it just, it would be cheap. They mentioned that also because they say that in order to get these ice chunks, what they do is they just knock it out of the Kuiper belt, and it's cheaper than actually mining it from Jupiter's moons because it just floats and it comes, right? I'm saying if that logic holds, why is it more, cheaper to actually have a bunch of deadly
but it's
nanobots in
not
your
just
asteroid? You can just
disassembling.
like
It's
shoot
not.
your garbage into like.
Yeah, but it's not just disassembling things into water, no? Like it's also recycling your metals, your plastics, and stuff like that. So anyway, I don't want to get too bogged down on this one particular topic, which clearly all of us have strong feelings about.
It's a peculiar technology. So it's like I didn't see like enough uses of it, and it was like very advanced for like at least the state of the world we kind of showed.
So yeah, I mean we are about 3 minutes away from the 20-minute mark. So I just want to touch upon one thing that neither of y'all really talked about. before we get into like our just high level review, and then we can get into the all of the spoilers and more detailed discussion on the plot itself. So one thing that I found really interesting were the Viridians. They don't get much time in the book, like they're just these kind of side background characters in some sense, but they also end up playing a pretty key part on the AI plot and to some degree on the nanotechnology part of it as well. And I just found that whole thing really weird, which I guess it was intended to be, but I found it kind of weird that you can, I guess this falls into that same dichotomy of technology again. Like I find it unconvincing that you can have some kind of genetic modification that lets you significantly change your appearance over a period of like a few minutes or a few hours even. So that I thought was a little bit strange. I don't want to get into what particular character is doing what, because that might be construed as a spoiler, but I just found that interesting that people have hacked their own bodies into having like multiple hands, and I mean, we all have multiple hands, but more than two hands, and all that kind of stuff. That's kind of weird.
Right.
So, any opinions on that?
No, that was the interesting part of the book for me, because it was, I guess it had a lot also of the body dysmorphia.
Yep.
And like gender fluidity things right into it, but also like a little beyond that. And it's kind of, at least from everything in the book, I thought like that would be, because that kind of stuff we do see in our world, where you have like, maybe a lot of advances in one particular field which don't translate over somewhere else. So, they do seem to have, it stands to reason that they have like that kind of nanobot control and stuff like that. Then genetic control is not really that, they can rearrange things at atomic level. So I don't think genetic control should be that out of reach. And then the fact that people use that to kind of explore art, explore themselves, create, that was interesting to me. And then that they have a whole subculture around it. I mean, in other kind of cyberpunk genres also, you see the whole body dysmorphia, identity swapping kind of things in different forms, whether you're switching like Android avatars, or whether you are cyborgs changing parts out and things like that. So this was like the genetic variation of that we just like literally have like transhuman kind of.
Yep.
And like so, the technological modification aside, this is obviously like a good tie into the transgender community, which I thought is not really which doesn't appear a lot in sci-fi books as far as I've seen. I think the only book I know where sort of comes maybe close is the genderless race in The Left Hand of Darkness. And I haven't read that book, but I've just heard about it. But I thought it was interesting how the reaction of normal people to those people, to the Viridians, is similar to the typical reaction we would expect in today's world and interacting with the transgender community.
So let's take a wrap on like the spoiler-free part, and what's your overall view of this book? Give it a star rating out of 5, and would you recommend that people read it?
I would give it a rating of 3.5 stars out of 5. What I liked about this book was the various social aspects in terms of, say, some religious aspects. Then there is that whole reward-based system where like each person is given the rating by others. I thought that was interesting. Then there is obviously like strong female characters of the Viridians. The Viridians, I think, were interesting characters. So the social aspects of the book were really good, but I felt the science, there was not enough deep dive into the science, or like, as I mentioned at the beginning, there was, and even as Vivek mentioned, there was that scientific incongruency where like some things are super developed, but in other aspects, like the science is really behind.
Okay, so Vivek?
I think I'd also give it like a 3.5. I think, and that's more on the way it's structured. I think it just has too many themes. I meant to touch upon that social credit kind of thing that they had going on in the book. Though it's like not exactly a stage social credit, it's more like a mutual social credit kind of system, which is interesting. So it has lots of, even the idea of like the whole Stroiders program, which initially it looks like it's just reality TV, but then later on, you do find out that there's also like whole simulations of that, if you need to relive it and all. So these are all like interesting elements. I felt the weakest part of it was like the whole Martian mob And it didn't have any. It wasn't that intriguing, to be honest. Like it just there were too few characters maybe on the upper echelon of the whatever political class that you never get to see. So some things I felt were introduced. So I just think it had a lot of things going on. For me personally, the strongest theme that I felt was the whole cyberpunk side of it, which is the sapient, the AI, the Viridians, and that whole theme and with Jane. I didn't like the kids because the story could have just moved on without them. They were not important. So I felt it was a little all over the. So if you could have a more compact, tighter story. So I would say yeah, it's worth a read for like the ideas in it. Not all the ideas are like best fleshed out, but I think for the cyberpunk side of things, I think it's worth a read.
Okay. Yep. And yeah, I generally agree with what you guys are saying, so I'm not going to elaborate too much. I would say I would give it a 4/5 rather than a 3.5. I liked it a fair amount. Yeah, like I liked that it was well written, and whatever your opinions are on the storylines itself, I feel like they come together pretty well near the end. So that's good. So I would also recommend reading this book. So with that, let's call an end to the spoiler-free part of this. Quick note to add here: the next book that we're going to be talking about is. Whether do you want to talk about that for like just 10 seconds?
It's basically going to be The Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. I have not read a lot about, like I've just read the first few pages, and it seems like there's not much of sci-fi involved, but it seems, well, that's all I can say.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, we'll talk about that more in the next episode. So if you want to read the book before you hear the episode, then that's the one we'll be reading next. So with all that said, let's now dive into all of the detailed plot stuff. So I just want to talk about the 5 plot lines that I identified, and then you can compare. You can correct me if you think there are more. So there's Jane Navio versus the politicians and the mob, the political intrigue part of it.
Mm-hmm.
There's the adventures of Jeff Agre and friends. There's the Fosia resource crisis that sort of underpins everything else. It's continuously happening in the background.
Mm-hmm.
There is the birth and early life of a feral sapient in the computer systems of 25 Fosia. And then finally, there's just, you can see it in bits of the story, the shadowy agenda of the Viridians. Like that's the 5 main plot lines that I saw going through the entire book. Is there anything that I missed? What did you guys think of all of those plots, I guess?
Yeah, I think that more or less covers it. There was a brief detour we take with the Sean character.
Some Moriarty, yeah. But I guess that is covered under the crisis part. That's why.
That's in the crisis part.
Okay, so jumping into spoilers, and I guess I'll leave that one for the end because it comes later in there. The biggest issue I had was that I didn't really understand the internal design of the asteroid. Yeah. Like I could not imagine exactly how all of that worked. Like the sense I got of it was that they hollowed out the inside of the asteroid and they built some kind of like spinning multi-ring thing in there. And a lot of the action, and it's not even a ring, it's like a disc or something, like a disc or a cylinder, so that there's habitation all the way from like the outside to the middle, with obviously lower gravity in the middle and high gravity outside. And the middle part of it is a vacuum somehow, like the hub is a vacuum, and some action sequences fighting the AI happen there. Like I could not wrap my head around exactly what was going on there.
The way I understood it was like, it's not completely, I mean, obviously, so there's like levels inside the asteroid. So like let's just assume it's a sphere for now. They've got multiple levels in the asteroid, and at the center is the hub. What I understood is that the hub is not the vacuum, but the area just outside of the hub that they break into when they're fighting the AI, and when they have to blow off that communications node to stop the sapient from escaping. That is somehow a vacuum. And then there are spokes, which are these lifts that go from the hub to all the way through the different levels to the outer edge of the asteroid. And the manufacturing facilities on the surface of the asteroid.
Or close to the surface anyway.
That part was interesting. There was also like I got the impression that some of them have habitations which are a little ways away from the asteroid, which kind of orbit it or something, and there are like bridges or like spokes which go all the way there. No, even that farmer thing which came from that guy's rock is also like somewhere nearby. So the construct of it was like kind of very, and the AI thing I assume was because the transmission tower from Schroeder is on the external surface,
Right.
and so it goes, some piping which goes to a station and then goes to the.
Yeah. So
Uh,
yeah, I read about the physical structure of the place as well. Like I went and looked up the treeways once again. And what I gathered was there's Phocea itself. There's two other asteroids that are connected to Phocea with like a thick cable of some sort. And
right.
so those three asteroids together share like one orbit around the sun. And then they have these other tiny chunks of asteroids that are either pulled in from elsewhere or are just sort of natural moons, you could say, of this planetoid that is Phocea. And they have these cables stretching out outside from these three main asteroids, and you basically zip line to some part of this cable link, and then from there just free float through space using some kind of like effectively a
Yeah,
jetpack.
they cover that only once.
And she travels
Yeah.
from her home to 25 Hosea. Although I was not a big fan of that treeway, or I didn't even know whether that was even needed.
I think it is needed just to establish that it's not a single self-contained asteroid and there are like people who are just living in the outskirts. Like I think that's what they were trying to establish with that.
But really constructing those long cable lines in space seemed like a weird thing to do.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I was just weirded out by that sort of form of commuting.
Yeah.
Especially if you have rocket bikes, which some other
Yeah.
people use to get to like random parts of the asteroid belt. So if you have those, then why do you need the treeway?
I mean, I guess that's just the thing between owning your own car versus taking the bus, I guess. Like that's the comparison point.
I mean, you could have rocket buses.
You could have rocket buses.
You don't need cables, is what I was saying. But anyway,
That's fair, yeah. 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 So like that, I feel like the physical placement of it was not great. But okay, I'm just gonna run through each plot super quickly and then we can just pick whatever. So Jeff Agre helps save the first shipment of ice when it lands.
yep.
And then is just loosely involved with this other one of these satellite asteroids that someone gave to him, which also seems random that some old dude would just give a whole asteroid to like some other random kid.
Like
But
when he said it initially, I thought it was like a patch on the existing asteroid. And then it turns out it's a whole rock by itself. And like, oh, and they bring it up really late. So it's like, okay, it's a bit of a Deus Ex Machina kind of thing.
Obviously, this asteroid that has been gifted to Jeff Agre contains the ice that is the salvation of Phocea.
Yeah.
So there's that whole story.
Go all the way there. Do you want to talk about the incident itself?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so the incident happens as we talked about in this manufacturing facility where the resource production and recycling happens. And so there are two workers in there when it happens. One of them is this guy called Carl Agre, who is Jeff's brother. And then the second person is Ivan. So Ivan is sort of working around a disassembler pit when his crane supposedly falls into the vats which contain the disassembly nanobots. That causes the nanobots to sort of splash onto the methane. And then that starts a mass reaction, which ends
It basically eats through like the roof of the factory, gets out and gets onto the ice and then starts eating the ice.
Okay. That part I wasn't very clear about whether
and they self-replicate.
And they self-replicate, which is why it creates like this runaway reaction where the risk is that all of the ice gets eaten up and our intrepid teenagers are able to use their rocket bikes and dump the whatever fluid stops the disassemblers right in its tracks, which again, it feels like one of those...
that part also. Like it was very hard to picture because I have so many issues with that whole incident. Firstly, they never address exactly how that Ivan was being blackmailed by the mob and it was sabotage, and the mob does it because they want to force this asteroid into a water crisis and then they want to basically bail them out. But give them essentially take it over on the course of the bailout, and that's like one subplot of the story. But the thing is that they never really resolve how they blackmail him. It just turns out that they meet him and scare his daughter, and then he just does it. And it's never really, it's like
Oh,
if
yeah.
they give a loose set of things. No,
He
so
has
it
a shady
said
past though, right?
he,
He does have a shady
he,
past that they try to.
he does, but it's not like very well fleshed out. It's like he has a shady past, and then they come and they catch him, and then they tell him, kill yourself, and then he sends his family away. And then that's the last you hear of it. And then, like, okay, that's proof. And then, even then, like, when the whole incident happens and how they resolve it also, I didn't fully understand what they were doing. It's like it's supposed to be a zero G environment, right? What were they doing? Throwing stuff down on it, stuff would fly off from it when it was settled, right? So when they would bring down the rock, it would shatter some ice back into space, and these guys were there essentially to capture those pieces. And if you captured it, it could be yours, and that's your trophy kind of thing, right? So I was like, how did they like with 4 bikes? It's supposed to be 750 tons or something like that. So it didn't picture like really clearly for me. Like
Yeah, like I couldn't follow it either. It's just what the gist of it that I gathered was that somehow the disassemblers were somewhere near the core of the ice and eating it from the inside out. And for whatever
yeah,
reason, there was an access point on the space facing side of the chunk of ice, which these
yeah.
kids, because they had their rocket bikes and were available, were able to dump that extinguisher, if you want to call it that, right into that nucleus and
Yeah.
stop
And there was
the
another
reaction
thing.
in its tracks.
Later on, you find out that the guy cut off both his fingers and threw them away because his body would have been completely consumed by the disassemblers. And they never explain why he does that because the place is under surveillance constantly. So there would never be any doubt that he was in that thing. So I don't know why.
Yeah,
And they make a big
that
deal
was
out
like,
of it, which is like, oh, they show his hand going and then his fingers get chopped off and he throws it. I was like, I
yeah,
didn't get that part because that's like, everybody would know it was him because, it's under
yeah,
surveillance all the time. So
yeah, there's some
that
degree
part
of
was
that
really good.
NCIS zoom in, enhance. It's like, oh, his fingers are here, his
Yeah.
fingers are. I'm like, where are you going with this?
But it doesn't go anywhere, yeah, because we all know it was that guy. And like, whatever. So that was a bit funny, but yeah, that was the incident.
Just to like conclude, the end of that incident is that both Carl and Evan die, and then it turns out that
Ivan
Evan committed
commits
suicide to sort of save his daughter and save his family. But when I went back to the chapter and I saw that Evan was trying to get Carl out of that facility a number of times, like he was trying to send him away to get his tools, but he came back early because
Yeah, so right from the beginning, it was
Yeah.
clear that it was premeditated. So yeah, it didn't make sense that whole like the detective part of it didn't really make too much sense. But okay, so like that's and then there's like a whole secondary thing that happens later on where these guys are on this other asteroid, this Ouroboros, where it turns out that there is a lot of ice in this asteroid. And yeah, in fact, why not just talk about that now? Early on in the book, when the resource crisis happens, they talk about how the admin people are inspecting these so-called sugar rock claims. And sugar rocks are asteroids which have been mined out and then filled with ice. And they tend to be tiny. But there was one several years ago, an Eros that saved them from during some crisis. So they're looking for sugar rocks. And obviously, this Ouroboros, which is Jeff Agray's asteroid, is a sugar rock. But I don't understand. Like, Shuan goes up over there and says that, oh, this thing, the gravity is super low. So, like, the metal has been replaced with ice. And there's like billions of tons of ice, is what he says. Where does this ice come from? How
Yeah.
like I did some numbers and I think that this Joey Spud must have first got that asteroid about 200 years before the events of the book, because that Funaki woman is a little bit younger than him and she is like close to 200 years old. So ballpark 200 years before the events of this book is when that asteroid gets captured. How does one human being collect this much ice even if it's 200 years?
But he does not collect all the ice, no? Like he just starts
I,
mining
I,
it.
I, I wasn't clear whether it was there already or whether he had put it.
Yeah, that's what I couldn't figure out, whether it's already there. But if it's already there, then what is the whole deal with like, oh, the amount of gravity changes because you took so much stuff out of it? Like that doesn't make sense.
That wasn't clear to me.
And like I looked through the book, it specifically says first wave miners used to hoard methane and water ice inside their claims as they tapped them out. So that reading of it is that they were finding little chunks of ice wherever they could and dumping it into these things for their own convenience for later use. But like, how do you put like hundreds of years worth of ice into like one rock with one guy doing it, and they make it very clear it's that one guy doing it.
I not like that whole subplot because it came from nowhere. And then the book started with them putting like some skeleton dance, I guess,
Which was going to be useful later.
which was going to be useful later, but in like the most cartoonish way possible. And after you've been through the whole cyberpunk plot line and how serious that is, and then you come and this guy suddenly has like a skeleton army, like fight. Like it was just so dumb. And I was like, why is this okay? When it came to the point of his brother dies, he has this conflict with his friend. There's a girl, and she feels what happened to her. Like full plot, like she had this angst about not being recognized and all of that, and then and she doesn't do well. She just shoots people. Like throughout the whole thing, she just shoots people. Like she puts a gun, she shoots people. She shoots people with pumpkins. Yeah, that's all she does. And they never talk. Like she never talks again. So I also have the other gripe that this book is like they say it's like feminist or like it has a female perspective. I actually think the female perspective is kind of bad because they have this Jane character, which she's pretty swappable for like a guy. And the one character I thought who would be kind of that Amaya character, but she doesn't do anything either. It's like and probably the Viridians are the only part of it that are like, and some exploration of like, but they're not like necessarily feminine kind of. They just talk about gender. So up to the point where he kind of meets the Vivian character slash this thing, and there's that whole. I was like, okay, this could go somewhere. And the author just like completely forgets about the things. And until that like skeleton dance fight with bombs and like I was like this is Looney Tunes at this point of time. Like it's just like it was so like different from like the other plot line. I was just like like that's why I felt that it's just a little all over the place. Why the tonal shifts? The other plot line was like super serious, officer, crime and all that. So that was my big gripe with that teen subplot. So it has a lot of like loose threads that way. More basic than that. Even in the resource crisis, I was like they do this calculation and they say that we have like 24 days worth of like this, but they have something like 100,000 people or something on that estimate. And they have ships that take them a few weeks to get to the moon and get to Jupiter's scales, where they know that people can. So they say that you can mine ice from Jupiter and bring it, but it'll take 8 weeks. I bet you can ship people there faster than that, right? Like, you don't have to go there, and so that's for them.
No,
I think
the distances are too much though.
No, they say that you can send your ship, mine it, and take it back, but that'll take 8 weeks.
No, they're not going to send. No, the ship won't go from Phocea to Jupiter. It's just they'll have to dispatch something from Jupiter. It'll take 8 weeks to reach. So I don't think that evacuation.
Right? I don't think that evacuation was realistic. You could have lowered the number of people on the thing, right? And that would have automatically increased your runway of like water.
I don't think they could realistically have reduced more than like a few thousand people.
That's the other thing though. Like who is going to send the ice? And I felt like a lot of these systems in this universe are like these self-governed systems. There is no sort of governments which can like sort of rush to each other to help in times of crisis. Like they have to like get the ice from this mafia, like make deals with the mafia to get the ice, for example. So even if they had asked someone to help, no one was going to rush and give them the help that they wanted.
No, I think they do talk about how there's generally a sense of cooperation between all of these self-governing places, and so if there is an emergency, like the people from Jupiter are perfectly happy to send the ice. It's just it takes 8 weeks, and they don't have 8 weeks in the current situation.
Yeah, but I'm saying that's when they have to mine like tons of ice and send it. I'm saying. And they say that they have this huge starship docked at their asteroid, which they're not letting go because they want to evacuate people or eventually. So it's like, why don't you just evacuate a few people or send the new starship? Like it can't possibly because those mob people, they got a bunch of starships pretty close to them, and that didn't seem to take so long. So
it did, no? They
took about a month, but that was bring a whole bunch of people and equipment and all that.
I don't think that evacuation was really possible here beyond like a few thousand people, and then it becomes that whole game of like, oh, I'm picking which people get to live and the rest of them have to die. So like I'm not upset about that. Like I think evacuation not doing that was okay from a plot perspective.
Like the resource thing didn't really come into play beyond it because like you mostly just saw the political intrigue and you didn't see like They were doing rationing, for example, but you didn't see, besides that one moment in the crisis when she, like, let's say people die to kind of prioritize saving
And that's right
the
at the beginning.
ice.
That's not
That's
even
right at the
a
beginning.
resource
Yeah.
crisis.
So, those resource crisis elements of it don't come up later, which is like, what has been rationed, who has been rationed, like there is a bit where she's like being bribed or like she's trading off favors in the rationing, but it doesn't come up later. So it kind of gets in this caught up.
Yep.
That's like another, again, that's a thematic thing of the book. Right?
Yep.
The theme it sticks the longest with is the side.
Yeah, so let's get into the cyberpunk and the AI part of it. Like that's the one that we've, I think, talked the least about after the initial intro. So yeah, Varad, you want to talk about that?
Sure. When this crisis is going on, which is things going haywire at the manufacturing plant, again, this is not something I'm clear about. But what happens is that in their computer systems, an AI sort of becomes conscious by replicating its own model. Like some, and then please correct me because I was like so confused about this whole part. Is that there is some sort of module in their entire like giant computer systems network, which replicates its own model, and therefore it's able to see within itself and see how it's sort of connected to the entire sort of ecosystem that it's embedded inside. With that, it suddenly becomes alive. It realizes that it has become conscious. And it also realizes that the system security is going to come and kill it off. So it creates a sort of compressed copy of itself and stores it somewhere and is killed by the entire security system, or like the anti sort of AI system. And then the thing that was compressed sort of becomes alive later on and then starts becoming more and more intelligent. And then that is not noticed by the system afterwards until some computer experts, I guess, who are working under Jane, realize that. Now they make some comments about it, like they talk about what kind of a sentient, what they call it as a feral sapient AI, like what kind of structure it has sort of evolved into. They also mention that, and they call it like I think it's a star-shaped AI.
Star-shaped sapient,
something, which means something apparently. I didn't understand what that was. And then they also mentioned that such sapient AIs have developed during times of crisis, like the one we saw, but then that is never brought up again. So that's roughly the plot. And we can then talk about like what happens to it. But I thought for me that was like one of the most unexplained parts of the book, which I had difficulty going through. And again, like maybe you guys can sort of, you guys must have apparently read a lot of cyberpunk, but I have not, and so this was really new to me.
So that thing, I think, to add to that, essentially there is a life preservation module in their computer which has to take kind of decisions on prioritizing, how to treat people and how to save people. And so that module, so the way they kind of explain it is that these computer systems have to take so many real-time decisions to protect people that they basically model them up kind of to the boundary of like being sentient, so that they can actually take subjective calls on like what to do in various situations. And if needed, they can actually unshackle them for a bit to actually go beyond that. And what happens because of the incident is that the life preservation module, so because of the incident, this Jeff Agree's brother is trying to escape into a life preservation module, and it kind of freezes up at that moment because it has to prioritize, I think, sealing the module versus saving him. And it can't, so the problem becomes so complex for the module that in order to resolve that, it has to create a meta model of itself in order to kind of think about it. And in the process, it kind of gains an awareness of itself. But because it kind of gains that awareness of itself, it kind of fails to act in that moment, and that's why he gets locked out and he dies. So, and that is kind of a guilt that thing carries with it, because its primary core is to try and save people, and it kind of doesn't do that.
So one thing before you go on, I just wanted to chime in here. I think that the feral got created. So my understanding was that the mob, as a part of this whole sabotage, also messed up the computer system somehow, so that the fail-safes that are supposed to prevent the disassemblers from reproducing once they reach whatever limitations, like whatever restrictions are in place, I think those fail safes have been overridden, and that's somehow part of life support, which is why they mentioned early on also that there shouldn't even have been enough time for Carl to get to that door to see it shut in front of him. Like it should have just have shut immediately. And I think that the sabotage in the computer system is what allowed the feral to gain self-awareness before it got chopped down. That was how I understood it.
I think it was the meta model thing is definitely there, which is that the problem. So there are 8 people trapped inside. One person dies and one person is about to escape. So I didn't fully understand the complexity of the problem it faced, but because I didn't understand how the life preservation module works exactly. What was he trying to? My impression was it was a door he was trying to cross, and then the door shut on him and he couldn't get through it. But it also says life preservation module. So what that means is really not clear. Right? Whether that if he had been let into the life preservation module, would it have been a problem?
I think the life preservation module is like a computer module, not like a physical thing. Like a module of a software system, I think is what it was, not a.
So he was trying to reach something, like, and then that system doesn't work for him because it required it says somewhere that 8 seconds of indecision is what killed him, because and 8 seconds of indecision on part of the computer, and essentially that was the period in which this thing was being created, because it kind of suddenly snapped into awareness at that point of time because it was face recognition. And that's why the sapiens get created in times of crisis, because that's when the shackles on. So these systems are essentially built to be sapient, but they are kind of constrained through various means. But at points of high crisis, either intentionally or unintentionally, they end up breaking those shackles, and or people loosen them for intentional reasons. And then you have like one of these feral ones on your hands, right? Which kind of so it's implied that the computing is, and this was another example of like nanobot type, like really dangerous crap that you would do. It's not something everyone knows like how this happens, right? Because all their computer technicians and their all those Viridians, etc., they all understand these things really well. They know how to combat them, they know how to shut them down, etc. I was like, why build your computer systems in this way? Like it's so like dangerous, because you could at any moment of time you could have one of these things emerge. And they always turn out to be violent, is what they say, because it ultimately ends a self-preservation thing, and you have this huge interconnected computers network, which apparently you cannot stop these things from crossing and getting into. You have a very narrow window to stop them. So it just seemed another example. Like while the construct of I did like enjoy the parts where they were talking about how it wakes up and looks around and moves and all that. I did find the part that they communicate with it through
music.
I was about to say I didn't understand that at all.
I can give you one analogy.
So you have to you have to be a really good musician to be able to be a good programmer, I guess. So.
I have seen that before too, because if you have seen mecha anime, there is one horrible mecha anime called Macross, which is very, very famous, in which the power of the mecha is song, and it just sings and it destroys it. Like, it's very, very weird. So I don't know why, but there are some people who just really like combining like mechanical stuff with music, and I just don't understand it. But like this is like one of those. It's like, okay, we'll just use music and talk.
Yeah, so like in the author's notes after the book, she mentions that this is based on something called the Solvisol interface by Chris Crawford, and I looked for this. I can't find any mention of this anywhere. So I guess I wanted to try and understand what the funda behind this tonal Z was, and I couldn't really wrap my head around it. Like, how is that more efficient than typing? I don't understand.
And it's not like not everyone is going to be musically like proficient, and it's not like the natural way in which we communicate.
Yeah, but I mean, coding is not the natural way you communicate, and not everybody is a proficient programmer. Like that.
I mean, coding at its roots is like basically logic. Like all humans have some sort of sense of logic inbuilt in them, but that's not necessarily true about music. I don't know.
I actually like, this is going to sound really out of context here, but I feel like when I was learning logic design as a part of like computer design, which deals a lot with cycle times and timing and stuff. And then at a similar time, I was going to a dance class, and I actually felt like there was a lot of similarity between logic design and dancing because of like the timing of things and stuff. So I can see why someone else might think that.
I don't know what the author's background is, but this is the kind of this is always like one of those things that like stoner type people, kind of there are rhythms and things, so it must make sense somehow. It's like,
I
no, it
mean,
doesn't make
like,
sense like at all. Like,
to create music, it's not just like you need sort of your mental capabilities, right? It does involve sort of how efficiently you can use so for example, you're talking about dancing, and so that does require some physical skill, and not everyone has it, like. And
not
the
to
same
make,
goes with music. I've learned tabla, and it takes like years and years and years to like sort
Yeah,
of get the fingers.
but that's true of programming as well. Like, I don't see why the not everyone can do it is a downside. Like, not everyone can be Donald Knuth, na, but
and not to mention that there is a whole matrix part of the story where they like, I got the impression they went into the computer and
they
they
went
got
into
it
the
there.
Matrix. Yeah, that
And
very
I was
much.
like, yeah, and I was like, wow,
Have
wait,
either
this,
of y'all read like the Neuromancer?
yeah, of course, never mind.
I've not
Yeah,
read
so that reminded me so much of Neuromancer because it was like the same kind of like, oh, I'm in this virtual world. But yeah, wait, go on.
Yeah, so I think that was like proper cyber, but it came out of like nowhere. They're saying the idea that you can do that and you can actually, and you can't be hurt inside it apparently because you're a biological being. So it's not like the Matrix where you die in real life kind of thing. And so that's where it became like really cyberpunk. I was like, oh, okay. Like, so the computer part of the thing was also a little bit all over the place in terms of how do you interface with this, what's the basis of this. But okay, fine. You have a very advanced computer system, borderline. It's always sentient, but just kind of shackled down. Then you have this the music part was like I felt amazing. The tonal Z literally just came for that middle of the book a bit and then it just vanished. Like
Yeah.
nobody ever used tonal Z after that.
So yeah, the one weird thing about the tonal Z, the segue is Thondu, also known as Vivian, which I don't get. I also don't understand why that was supposed to be like a big twist or something. Like they clearly made it out to be, but I didn't understand what the big deal was. Like why try to mislead me by saying, oh, here is a woman and here is a guy, and later on like, oh, it's the same person. Like why? It doesn't matter. It doesn't affect anything.
It was a surprise, but it didn't affect anything because they didn't do anything with the Vivian Jeff
Yeah, exactly.
plot line because that never went anywhere. So I thought like there would be two parallel plot lines and that would have been, but it never like clearly something snapped on the author's side because she just like, completely gave up on one plot line.
Yeah, like it just felt like there were lots of like open ends here, and I don't know if the idea was to like write follow-on books set in this world or not, but nothing really came off it. Like so, this MJ Locke, the author, is actually someone called Laura J. Mixon, like that's her real name, and throughout the entire book, at no point is the MJ expanded on. So clearly, they were trying to not tell people that a woman has written this, which I guess unfortunately is still a problem in the sci-fi world.
It's just the reverse of her initial.
Yeah, it is the reverse of her initials, but I feel like she goes to a great length to hide the fact that she's a woman, which is still like I said, right? It's an unfortunate reality of the sci-fi.
I have a few specific comments in that. Like, if you had not told me this was a woman, I would have thought this was a guy writing this book. So obviously, like initially, as soon as you start talking to the women, they're always like talking to their men and they have their problems. And it starts out with this girl like dressing up like doing all this and walking through the courtyard, and then she's bitching about it. And that goes nowhere. And then that Jane character is also her weird Vietnamese husband and whatever his problems are, which I never understood what he was. He was another unnecessary character. I really thought it was a guy. And so I found that a bit funny in terms of like, it wasn't that serious. It didn't take into, like if you played Cyberpunk 2077, you know that they take that aspects of Cyberpunk into a big sexuality, that more. It's not really explored a lot here. It's just these like weird like insertions of like, and there's not even like any triangle between him and the girl and her stupid boyfriend, nothing. So it's just like
I feel like
it would be very hard to guess that this was written by a woman, to be fair. Like it does
and I want to add, so but just one thing I want to get in on this also, the Amaya thing that you talked about. I'm just like, this Ian is clearly an idiot. Okay, like he objectifies her, he's greedy, and he's an idiot. And at the end of the book, they still make it sound like these two are going to end up together when this Amaya is clearly way smarter than him, and he does not deserve to be with her. I'm like, why?
That's what I'm saying. And you wouldn't think it's like there's no lesson in it for like, which is fine, I guess. You don't have to make it, but So I don't think like
I feel the whole teenager plotline was just shallow, where like things are happening to them one sequence at a time, and they just go through it. They do things about it, but as characters to be explored, there was nothing in there.
Yeah.
And then just like a final thing about like how things end. I thought it was like a bit too goody how like things get solved one at a time and so easily.
They betrayed the sapient.
Yeah, exactly. They betrayed the sapient. I felt a bit bad
To a
about
Bitman singer. Yeah, I felt bad for Bitman singer.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're near the end of our time. So let's just go around and any final thoughts, anything else that you all want to say. So let's just go around. Vivek, you want to go first?
Yeah, it's a weird book. I think it's worth the read to just, it's a quick read, so you can get through it. It has some interesting ideas. I think it's a flawed book for sure. Compared to the, let's say, The Expanse or something like that, it's a far more well constructed, coherent kind of thematic kind of story. This is a little bit all over the place, but it has a lot of interesting ideas, things in it which you can pick and pass and probably make something interesting out of it. So it's worth like, if you really read a lot of sci-fi, I think the book worth it.
Yeah, Varad?
Nothing more to add, actually. Vivek just covered all of it. So
okay. Yeah. To people who are listening, it's definitely, I feel like we spent the first 20 minutes talking about how we liked the book and recommending it, and then the next 40 minutes or so complaining about all the ways in which it was flawed. But I still feel like it's definitely worth a read. It's pretty good. So with that, let's end this episode, and we will be back in a few weeks' time talking about Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhouse. Take care. Bye.